In the Kaaba, according to tradition, there were 360 idols. And these idols represented divinities from not only all over the Arabian Peninsula, but also beyond the Arabian Peninsula. What we see in some of the information that comes to us from the Quran about pre-Islamic religion is that a lot of these so-called gods were simply personifications of human or non-human powers and forces. For example, there's a discussion of a deity called Wad, W-A-D-D. I don't want to write all of them, but Wed. Wed was a personification of manly power. Another one called Suwa, and you don't have to know the Arabic names, but a personification of beauty, changeability. Quran talks about Yaguth, lion, brute strength. The image of Yaguth used to be a lion we get from historical accounts. Ya'uq, a term having to do with swiftness, was represented by a horse. Nasr, a term having to do with insight or sharp sight, was represented by an eagle. So in that sense, the gods of pre-Islamic Arabia were very much like the gods of some of the Native American peoples in this area. Okay, personifications of the same type. However, there was a little bit more. There are also what you might call gods and goddesses per se. There were a number of them, but perhaps the most important, there was a goddess by the name of Al-Lat. Now there's a lot of discussion about Al-Lat, exactly who she was. What's interesting is we can find evidence of a cult of Al-Lat extending all the way from Central Arabia all the way up to northern Syria in pre-Islamic times. For example, by the way, it's important to note, then as now, there were almost as many Arabs in the time of Muhammad living north of Arabia as there were in the Arabian Peninsula itself. So don't get the idea that somehow these Islamic hordes came out of the desert like locusts in a bad year and swept over the Middle East. What happened is that a number of Muslims came out of the Middle East and suddenly built alliances and had conversions among the Arabs already in the Middle East. It sort of was a snowball effect. So we can find about, easily a 1,000-mile stretch of an Al-Lat cult in pre-Islamic, among pre-Islamic Arabs. Some people say that Al-Lat is a version of the Greek goddess Leto. The only actual figure or statue of Al-Lat that I'm aware of is one that was found in Palmyra in northern Syria, where she appears as Winged Victory. But again, interestingly enough, you have a statue of Winged Victory with in Greek written underneath Al-Lat. In Greek. Another important figure, also a goddess, interestingly enough, was someone called Al-Uzza. Al-Uzza, according to the consensus of most scholars, was probably a representation of the planet Venus. Not Venus in the sense of the idea of love, that was more, say, Suwa, but the power, the planetary force of the planet Venus. A god, an important god, was called in Arabic Hubal. That's a little easier to identify. That's an Arabic version of the famous Phoenician god Baal. So as you can see, we already have here in pre-Islamic Arabia a religious context, a pagan religious context, that is rather typical and indeed shares a lot in common with the pagan religions elsewhere in the Middle East. Now, the reason I'm spending so much time on this is that I want to sort of disabuse you of the notion that is very popular among Muslims as well, that somehow Arabs were savages before the coming of Islam. Now, on one hand, that's a sort of anti-Arab thing to say. But on the other hand, it's a very good Islamic thing to say, because by showing the great difference between the Arabs after the coming of Islam and before the coming of Islam, it accentuates the value of Islam itself. And it all hinges on this concept of Jahiliya. Have you learned about this yet, this term? Al-Jahiliya means the period of ignorance. Jahil is the Arabic word for ignorant. An ignorant person is Jahil. It also, interestingly enough, secondarily means a rabid dog, like a Kelb Jahil. And it's certainly extremely important when one notes that the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, when they looked back on their prior lives, on their former lives before the coming of Islam, saw themselves as Jahil. Now, in later times, this concept of ignorance or Jahiliya has been taken by Muslims to mean more than just ignorance, but savagery. But what it meant very clearly in the time of the Prophet himself was that people were in a state of ignorance of true reality, the true nature of things, meaning the true nature of God, the true nature of existence.